Here are a couple of key concepts that are worth understanding a little deeper. The first is ports. If we look at any of our components, every component pretty well, with the exception of the trash, has input port or ports and an output port or ports. And each component has a slightly different usage for the input and output ports. So in the case of here our join, this is actually the ext hash join component. That's this one here. I've just renamed it. This one requires at least two input ports so that the data from each port can be joined together. But you could also have more ports. Each time I add a connection to a port, it will create a new empty one, so I could add subsequent edges to that port. And then some components have only one output port, so for instance a join will always only output one stream of data. But other ones, other ports could components could output data through more than one port. So for instance here in the case of readers, when it reads in records from a data source, the successfully read rows or records will be output to the first port. But if any rows fail validation, then they will be output to the second port. So the important thing really here is to, each time you want to use a component, to get a good understanding for the use of input and output ports. The next thing we're going to talk about is the graph XML. Now this is actually quite a useful little thing to be able to play around with. A graph, you can see we've been really looking at the graphical side of a graph, but in the background this is just generating XML, and to view that XML I click here on source, and here we can see we've got a load of XML. This XML actually is really the important stuff, and this is what is fed through to the underlying Clover engine. But I can edit this, and if I edit this here, it will be reflected when I switch back to the graph. So one of the useful spin-offs of this is if I was, for instance, doing a web demo to somebody and maybe chatting to them on Skype or in a chat window, and I want to give my friend at the other end of the line what I'm looking at, I just go to source, select all, copy and paste that into my chat window, and then the person at the other end can paste it into their source window, and they will then get a graph. And that will define all the components here. It will define metadata, connections. Obviously what you then have to be aware of is that the data sources are in place, so obviously it's going to try and pull from my data sources. So if I send it through to somebody, probably the data sources are going to have to be adjusted so they match up. And connections, same thing really. If you're talking to a database connection, for example, you're going to have to use at the other end, that person's going to have to put in the correct configuration details, which are probably going to be different to mine. So those are the two concepts that I'd like to introduce at this stage, and in the examples that follow in this intermediate section you'll see how those, particularly the ports, get used.